Welcome back to our video on Chapter 8, Human Development. We're going to return to the topic of prenatal development. Before we can talk about a child growing up, developing, changing, we have to first create said child. Now, most of you are familiar with the reproductive process. Men possess sperm and female possess ovum, euphemistically called eggs, which each one contains 23 chromosomes flat, not 23 pairs. And once we merge those sperm with ovum, we have the possibility of creating life. As we'll see in a little bit, there's some special things that have to happen beyond that process. Alright, most conceptions happen within a 3-day period. That's 2 days before and during ovulation. Part of the reason for the staggering is sperm do have several days they can exist in the uterus, and so it's possible to have sex before ovulation, but still fertilize that egg eventually. Now, many of you have heard of trimesters, but I want to throw those out. I want to teach you 3 periods of pregnancy that I want you to know, but they're not related to those 3-month cycles. Those are just arbitrary lines we draw to keep track of things as expected parents. The first period is called the period of the zygote, and it's just the first 2 weeks. Now, for each one of these periods, I'm going to give you sort of a checklist or some important things that need to happen to move to the next stages. If you were to take child psychology, you'll go into far more detail, or perhaps some other medical classes, so I'm going to keep this pretty simple for our purposes. For the period of zygote, in that first week, that's basically 2 cells that have merged together, will begin to divide. All right, we call this a blastocyst. You see a picture of it there, this fluid-filled ball of roughly 100 cells. Now here's the important thing. In the second week, that ball of cells must attach to the uterine wall. If it does not attach and burrow in what will be blood vessels, then no human life will occur. Because as many of you are familiar with, babies are basically parasites. We completely feed off our mothers. We require them to provide for us, and so we must attach to mom to do so. The second period is known as the period of the embryo, and that's the 3rd week to about 8 weeks. So again, don't worry about trimester. Now, this period of the embryo is unique because we call this the foundation stage. All right. If the last one was implantation, these few weeks are about building that foundation of cells that eventually will become those parts and pieces we think of as human. So basically, layers of cells begin to specialize, and so we'll see the beginning of organs, the neural tube, which one day will be a spine, small buds that will one day be limbs, and some general features that you might consider facial, though let's be clear, during this embryonic phase, there are a few things to distinguish us from any other mammal developing in the womb. Basically, nothing that looks human as we think about it, but it's all about laying the foundations for what we will be. Our third and final period is the period of the fetus, and that's from the 9th week until that child is born, and this is called the finishing stage. So the cells begin to specialize. Organs, muscles, skeleton, skin, brain all continue to grow. And the last few weeks we'll see rapid increases in weight and size, usually about 5 pounds, several inches. So that is our child. That is our soon-to-be-born child. I'm not going to talk too much about the labor process. Again, I'll save that for another class, but I do want to make a quick reference to while we are in utero, the reason why we've attached to mom is that those blood vessels eventually will form what we call the placenta. That is the connection to mom. I know many of us think of the umbilical cord, and that's somewhat accurate. Think of the umbilical cord more like a garden hose. It doesn't produce the water, it merely moves the water to where it needs to go. Placenta is the actual organelle connected that's instructed to bring in nutrition, to remove waste, and filter some substances that could harm the baby, such as mom's blood. The umbilical cord allows us to have slack so that we're not literally attached, such as our head or arm attached to the uterine wall. So we have the freedom to expand these body parts, those limbs, for example. Now, I mentioned the placenta being that filter from some harmful substances, but unfortunately, quite a few can and do get by. And those things that can affect that child development we call teratogens. That's any toxic agent that can cross through the placenta and possibly do some sort of harm. Now, not all teratogens are the same, and I can't say, well, this is the month where it's good to do this, or this is the month where it's bad to do something, because different substances depend on critical periods. Critical periods are when we are most vulnerable. For example, with rubella or German measles, if mom were to get that within the first or second month of the pregnancy, that baby could be born blind, could have brain damage, other organ failure. If mom were to get rubella in the 9th month of pregnancy, baby's typically fine. They have passed that critical period. A question I'll toss out to you: what is the most abused teratogen by pregnant women? Meaning that we know this is toxic and dangerous for the child, but not most women, but more women use this than any other substance. The answer is alcohol. 1 in 4 mothers in the U.S. report drinking during their pregnancy. And many of you are familiar with various parts of the fetal alcohol spectrum, such as fetal alcohol syndrome, has very distinct facial characteristics, brain damage characteristics. So we know for a fact that it is harmful. And yes, there's some evidence that perhaps a small amount of alcohol during pregnancy actually would be fine, but unfortunately we are not a culture of moderation, as I've mentioned before. And this can be very dangerous, sometimes deadly to a developing child. Other common teratogens: smoking, specifically nicotine. Nicotine is a substance that, 1, is both highly addictive, and 2, functions by restricting oxygen. It basically constricts blood vessels. Well, if you deprive your body oxygen, you're then depriving your child oxygen since they're not breathing. Smoking has been linked to miscarriages. It has been linked to premature births. And recently we found that women who smoked during their pregnancy, their children were more likely to be diagnosed with a mental illness than those who did not. There are other things that aren't necessarily chemicals that we bring into our body. For example, high-stress environments do seem to have an effect on a developing child. And let me be clear, pregnancy is stressful. That's normal, that's expected, and that's fine. When I mean high-stress situations, look at some of the stuff I've listed here. Incredible poverty to where mom can't provide for herself or the child. Constant abuse or violence or danger towards that. So these social stressors can and do affect the developing child. Some of you are familiar with the concept of being born premature. Basically that means prior to 37 weeks after conception. Children who are born premature are at a higher risk for physiological illnesses, for cognitive disabilities. However, let's be clear, ultimately your postnatal experience can and does play a crucial role. That's why most hospitals are set up, if not all, are set up to help combat the effects of premature birth by stimulating the child, having protective barriers such as isolates, teaching parents care like kangaroo care. So if premature children are born and are met with appropriate interventions, all of those possible dangers can be avoided. So let's go through a quick checklist of, if you're pregnant, things mom can do to help that baby be as healthy as possible. First, mom, if you are already vaccinated against some of these illnesses, your baby is much less likely to get those. So, vaccinate yourself. Secondly, as soon as you think you're pregnant, you should see a medical professional. I know you can use home pregnancy tests, and it's a great place to start, but if you suspect there's something going on, you should receive medical care and continue to receive medical care. Lack of any prenatal visits has been linked to 3 times being born underweight and 5 times more likely to die in the first month. So get those doctor visits. Third, educate yourselves. Being pregnant does not magically make anyone, male or female, have knowledge about what to do, how to do it. So get education, get the resources, find what you can. Fourth, moms need to be healthy. Well, certainly fathers need to be healthy, and that can affect their sperm count. But ultimately, since mother has to carry the child, we have to watch what we bring into our body. Make sure that we're eating well, eating appropriate foods, healthy foods whenever possible. And yes, exercise is important. Now let's be clear, I am not talking about exercise to lose weight. That should not ever happen. Instead, we're talking about exercise to stimulate the heart, stimulate the lungs, get that oxygen flowing. And finally, when possible, try to avoid high stressors. Again, pregnancy is normal. It's normal to be stressed. But there are people and places and situations that are way too much for someone to handle, and when possible, try to avoid them. Alright, we're going to stop there. When we come back, we're going to talk about that new child we've just created. We'll assume all is well, birth has gone well, and so we'll see what this kid can and cannot do. See you then.